You want to dive into the stories and myths behind Professor Scienza's new series, but Italian isn't your thing. No problem. You find all the conversation translated in English in the new Mama Jumbo Shrimp book, An Italian Wine Pilgrimage with Professor Attilio Scienza. Now available in English on Amazon.
So whether you're a sommelier, a buyer, a sales rep, a producer, importer, educator, or just a student of wine, anywhere in the wine world, here's the challenge. Question the narrative you have inherited. Ask whether the words you use actually illuminate wine or simply decorate it. Ask whether you are telling a story that flatters the bottle or one that deepens the listener's understanding of it. Because wine deserves more than slogans. It deserves honesty, interpretation, but more so, it deserves storytellers who are brave enough to make complexity compelling. I think that's how we keep wine relevant. We keep it alive, and that's how we make an old story new again.
Welcome to a special series on the Italian Wine Podcast. In this series, Italian wine ambassador Ryan Robinson reads and reflects on the art of wine storytelling, the latest book by renowned scholar Professor Attilio Scienza. From the myths of ancient Greece to the language of modern wine communication, the book explores how storytelling shapes our understanding of wine, and why these stories matter more now than ever. Let's begin the journey.
Welcome to the Art of Wine Storytelling on the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Robinson. In this series, we continue our journey through the remarkable work of Professor Attilio Scienza, where wine is never just a drink in the glass, but a story of people, place, identity, memories, and meanings. So in today's episode, we're going to take on the next 3 chapters. These feel especially timely in our modern wine world because they challenge some of the most common narratives we use when we talk about grapes, when we talk about the places the grapes come from, and especially when we talk about authenticity. We begin with the storytelling of autochthony, why a new narrative is needed. This chapter asks us to reconsider how we use wine's favorite words. Then we move to international grape varieties and the story of modern viticulture in Italy. It's here where we'll confront the tension between the local identity and that of the global influence. Finally, at the end of today's episode, we arrive at the chapter of Between Reality and Imaginary, the metaphor of the wine-growing landscape. So this last chapter that we'll cover today reminds us that the landscapes we celebrate in wine are never just physical spaces. They're shaped by memories and our aspirations, the symbolisms, and of course, storytelling. So together, these chapters, they ask a bigger question. How do we talk about wine truthfully in a world that loves simple narratives? In today's wine industry, words like narrative or international, traditional, and authentic, they're used consistently, but if we don't examine them carefully, they risk becoming empty slogans instead of meaningful ideas. These chapters, they challenge us to do better, to speak with more nuance, to tell fuller stories, to understand that the future of wine communication will belong to those who can move beyond cliche and into something more honest, more compelling, and more human. The story of autochthony and why the new narrative is needed. The term globalization, coined by Roland Robertson in 1992, defines the ambivalent articulation between the global and the local, between the interdependence of the world economy on the one hand, and the particular dimension of local context, with their traditions on the other. These two realities are both contrasting and complementary. They connote not only a set of economic, financial activities, but also a complex of symbolic, practical, social codes, and cultural habits that are linked to territorial communities. Agri-food production and wine production, in particular, represent the interpretive paradigm par excellence of a need for identity and recognition that arrives from the fear of anonymous social ties in an increasingly globalized world, and that finds in tradition. No matter if reinvented or remythologized, the anchorage of affectivity or belonging, as the French historian Jacques Le Goff defines them. The return to native vines and typical products of Italian food are the evidence of this attitude, but it is necessary to remove some misconceptions. Italy is the second largest producer of tomatoes in the world after the United States. The tomato and its derivatives are a fundamental ingredient of Italian cuisine and a symbol of made in Italy. So integrated with our food traditions that we consider them a native product of our country. Yet tomatoes came to us after the discovery of America. A similar consideration can be made for the vines that are grown in Italy. Most of them came from other countries, often giving rise to new varieties through spontaneous crosses, and only a small number are the result of domestication of the wild vines of a specific place. Varietal circulation in Italy is a very ancient phenomenon shaped by its bariatric position in the Mediterranean between the east and west. The first evidence of the arrival of foreign vines dates back to the great wave of migration of the Caucasian populations that took place during the early Bronze Age, from around 3000 to 4000 BC, and may have been caused by the disastrous impact of the so-called Black Sea deluge. The greatest varietal contribution, however, took place during the first millennium BC, with the Greek colonization of southern Italy. The use of autochthonous and as an adjective to describe vine varieties is quite recent and is the result of a cultural attitude called indigenism. This current of anthropology and archaeology aims to treat each society as autonomous and therefore to see its developments in essentially indigenous terms. We now define as Italian many food products that have become Italian in relatively recent times, or those that have undergone profound structural and sensorial changes with the transformation of modern processing techniques. Not to mention the fruits and vegetables that we consume today that perhaps only have the word Italian on the label. Returning to wine, and in particular to what is produced in or south, it's noticeable that modern techniques to make it fragrant with flowers or fruit or fresh for acidity, that it does not possess naturally, or worse, to give richer or more concentrated structure, make them lose that identity that makes them recognizable and imitatable. The existence of an important genetic variability in Italian viticulture, although economically negligible, finds its roots in present traditionalism and obligatory choice of rural communities in the past in order to deal with the risk associated with the unpredictability of environmental conditions, typically of the farmer's profession with inadequate tools. Where people live on the margins of the subsistence, there is no place for experimentation, especially genetic experimentation, a risk that can have catastrophic consequences. These simple considerations show how the evolution of allelographic platforms has not only recently been the result of intertwining of economic and cultural behaviors, while major genetic modifications have occurred mainly for causes beyond the control of wine growers and linked to major climatic changes. Adjective use to describe grape varieties such as minor, local, ancient, autochthonous, old, domestic, or indigenous are often used incorrectly to define what may seem like the same thing. In fact, a local grape variety is not always autochthonous, just as a minor grape variety is not necessarily ancient. The return of ancient or native vines to the global stage has brought back into vogue the crucial role of the grape variety in the communication of wine in an era where there is no time for geographical insights and the role of the aura that accompanies its origin and history, compared to a consumption made more with the brain than with the palate. Of course, these vines we often remember only their name because of curious vernacular. We have already forgotten, after a few years, the taste sensations of their wine through produced with oenological techniques that are not consistent with the characteristics of the vine and the remote location where they are grown. What should we do then? what path to take in a period of great changes in terms of consumption lifestyles, and last but not least, the climate. The pervasive element in every choice, whether it is productive or consumer, is globalization, accepted by many for its positive contribution to cultural complexity and commercial relationships. By others, it is considered disturbing and dangerous and therefore rejected. It is widely believed among producers and consumers that it is the main culprit of the increasing simplification of the sensorial characteristics of wines produced in all parts of the world. Strongly conditioned by perfect types of wines, but lacking in soul and unable to recognize praise of imperfection. In this sense, the role of communication and guidance is also important. Imperfection is not a defect, but often a basis of a wine that goes against the tide of an innovative wine. But globalization has also operated in the opposite direction, creating new opportunities for alternative forms of viticulture, such as biodynamics, in an attempt to maintain expressions of a wine's production that the pressures of scientific progress tend to upset. But turning to New Age philosophies to produce wine does not make much sense, nor does taking refuge in a tradition that is seen as the antidote to the evils of research. Nothing could be further from the truth, because as Hobsbawm and Ranger said in The Invention of Tradition, traditions have always been invented and reinvented to satisfy the purpose of the people who wanted to use them to legitimize their power. As a general rule, a local variety is also ancient because it has been cultivated in that place for a long time, although it seems problematic to specify the timescale due to the uncertainty in defining the time of introduction. A variety can be very old but not local. This is the case of vines from the East, which have long been cultivated in places far from their origin, such as Moscato and Malvasia. Often the difficulties encountered in tracing the origin of the varieties are also due to the change that the name of the vine undergoes, as it passes from country to country and undergoes a sort of vernacularization that makes it local through the use of dialectal expressions. Local varieties often take on names that derive from specific characteristics of their morphology or productivity, their vernacular name, such as the color of the berry, the habit of the vegetation, the shape of the bunch, the ripening period, or place of origin. This is because the selection of these vines, whether of local origin or introduced, was strongly integrated with the traditional agricultural system and made the subject of particular cultivation practices. Moreover, the wide intervarietal genetic variability, if it had not allowed them to adapt better, would have limited their interest if they were separated from their environment and anthropological context as an expression of cultural particularities of the agricultural society to which they belong. If autochthonous is a concept linked more to space than to time, one wonders how long it takes for a vine to be considered an expression of a place and therefore, in all respects, autochthonous. In recent years, on the wave of renewed interest in such vines, there has been much discussion about the definition of autochthonous. It is therefore legitimate to question what autochthonous actually means in relationship to a great variety. If we stick to its etymological meaning of a vine born of that place, perhaps in Italy, we do not have more than a dozen native vines. In fact, most of them either came from other countries or are the result of spontaneous interbreeding phenomena. It is probably not possible to give an unambiguous definition of autochthonous viticulture for Western European viticulture, except perhaps for those vines derived from the domestication of local wild vines, or for the varieties obtained from them by genetic introgression. Much better would be to replace the word autochthonous with that of ancient, local, and Italic. Is it necessary to show the geographical origin of a grape variety to define it as autochthonous? Sangiovese is the progeny of Strinto procanicum, an ancient vine of the Vesuvius area, and has family relationships with Vesparola, Ciguagello, its son. It has shared kinship relationships with the cultivars of 4 Italian regions: Basilicata, Calabria, Puglia, and above all with Sicily. In which Italian region can it be considered autochthonous? The true meaning of the word then is not linked to a place of origin, but where the vine best expresses its genetic potential. Sangiovese is therefore native to Tuscany, to Montalcino, to Chianti, to Maremma, and to Montepulciano. Gone is the era of stateless vines, also known as international varieties, now cultivated everywhere, whose wines are increasingly destined for the lower end of the market. Gone is the confusion generated by a plethora of designations of origin without traditions or qualitative merits. What is the future then for Italian viticulture? In determining the quality of a wine, the still unresolved quarrel over the primacy of the grape variety over the environment and vice versa now belongs to the history of viticulture. Until the Age of Enlightenment, the place of production prevailed over that of the vines. Jules Gill was the first in 1868, on the threshold of the phylloxera crisis, to break this axiom with the revolutionary observation that the genus of the wine is in the grape variety. To those who invoke the return of tradition in wine production, however, we can answer that the most effective way to honor it is that of faithful betrayal. The interpretive paradigm that has driven viticulture progress over the centuries has been genetic innovation, represented by varietal circulation in the selection of international and spontaneous crosses. After about 2 decades of great interest in native vines on the part of wineries, research, and consumers, taking stock of the results achieved in terms of economic repercussions, it must unfortunately be noted that in terms of enhancement of the vines and territories concerned, these do not appear particularly exciting. There are, of course, some expectations to see a few vines achieve good results, but unfortunately, many others face oblivion. It is necessary, therefore, to disaggregate the factors so as to better direct efforts in the future. In summary, of the 1,000 and more native Italian vines, the quality ones are very few, perhaps no more than 100. This does not detract from the fact that all of them have great value for the conservation of biodiversity and for use in genetic improvement programs. Only a few grape varieties supported by successful DOC or DOCG, such as Nebbiolo for Barolo, Barbaresca, Valtellina, or Sangiovese for Brunello, Chianti, Nobili, to name a few, are expanding. Some ancient vines have been enhanced, no thanks to the institutions, but to the passion of a few winemakers. Few vines have emerged from oblivion in recent years to be registered in the National Register of Vines authorized for cultivation, the sine qua non condition for being multiplied and planted. International grape varieties and the story of modern viticulture in Italy. The presence of the so-called international grape varieties is so important in world viticulture that consumers do not consider them a particular category because they have been penetrated so deeply into wine culture that they shape the images and sensations we have in our heads of a Chardonnay or a Cabernet Sauvignon. The definition of international grape varieties in the language of viticulture, not only Italian, is quite recent and dates back to the 1980s, when a great project was launched in Italy to recover and enhance the hundreds of native varieties present, but practically unknown throughout the country. It is from almost competitive contrast of these two great varietal types that their compositional differences emerge. The different distribution to the organoleptic characteristics of the wines, to a presence that had only been almost ignored. Varietal circulation is a very ancient phenomenon in European viticulture, and if we exclude the contribution of ancient Greece, We can say that this silent invasion began during the Middle Ages with the introduction by the Venetians and the Genoese of some varieties suitable for productions of sweet wines, and continued later in the appearance of some Catalan and Spanish varieties in some central southern regions. At the beginning of the 1700s, there was the first interest in French wines. In Tuscany, the production of Claretto alla Francese, and in Friuli with the introduction of Pinot Noir. However, it was the Medici in 1773 who imported large numbers of vines from different European countries to evaluate them on their estates. However, the judgment on the real values of these varieties is critical. It was in the 19th century, however, that the presence of foreign vines, which came from other countries, France in the first place, became important from the point of view of their role in quality of Italian wines. In 1903, Mondini published I vigneti stranieri da vino coltivati in Italia, the foreign wine vines grown in Italy, a complete review of the presence in the various regions of the peninsula of the vines dating back to the 19th century began to play an economic role and were not only present in amphilographic collections. The main reason for these introductions, first made by some important wine producers of central northern Italy, was to emulate the success of French wines in the world, then the most important economic military power in Europe. The goal was to feed a current of export of bottled wines to replace the trade of blended wines that were highly appreciated on foreign markets, but not every competitive from an economic point of view. In the 1800s, France became the leading country in the production of wine and in the development of new varietal techniques, which began to permeate the Italian production world around after the second half of the 19th century with the unification of Italy, both for the role that Napoleon III's France has played in the wars of independence, and for the looming need to renew viticulture after the elements caused phylloxera. The first innovations transferred from France a few decades before the arrival of the so-called American disease were represented by certain vines, especially of Bordeaux origin, which were imported by some Tuscan and Venetian landowners to imitate those French wines, the clarets that were so successful in England. The first amphilographic collections, expressions of 19th century collecting, and the birth of the schools of enology contributed to the knowledge of the behavior of these vines in Italian environments and to the correct vinification of their grapes. The first Cabernet Sauvignon plantings date back to 1820 and were made near the town of Alessandria in the region of Piedmont. The most important noble families of Piedmont, Tuscany, and the kingdom of the two Sicilies often related to the French court, who consumed exclusively French wines, began producing these wines at the end of the 18th century. In Italy, there was never any talk of wines destined for foreign markets. At this time, the newly founded Accademia di Geografia stimulated, as part of a competition, the publications of works of wine erudition to improve the quality of Tuscan vines in order to promote their export. The winner, Dr. Cosimo Villafranchi, bitterly denounced that in Tuscany and elsewhere, the quality of the wines, whose production was inspired by the French model, had no link to the famous wines of Italic antiquity, thanks to mainly to inadequate winemaking techniques. In the instructions he provided for producing the best quality Chianti wine, however, he also fell into the tradition of long macerations and was almost responsible for the essence of the wines. In 1825, the Giuseppe Astorbe writer and naturalist from Mantova, considered the first Italian amphilographer, compiled a catalog listing as many as 903 foreign grape varieties in his collection, mostly from Austro-Hungary, of which Lombardy was then part. In 1852, Marchesi and Chese created an important collection in Rocchetta Tenaro, but did not limit himself to simply collecting foreign vines, but also evaluated their viticultural and enological value. Cabernets, Bordeaux, Gamay, Pinots stood out for their quality. These collections were the first of their kind in Italy, arousing many wine growers a curiosity and desire to experiment. What motivated such winemakers to introduce these new varieties? The desire to improve the quality of their wines, which native wines often did not guarantee, especially compared with other countries, especially France. The possibility of extending the cultivation of vines to less favored places where native vines did not yield good results. The hope of being able to cultivate vines more tolerant to cryptogamic disease, such as downy mildew and powdery mildew, had recently appeared, and adverse weather conditions. The pace of change accelerated sharply in the second half of the 19th century with the arrival of phylloxera, which required the reconstruction of Italian viticulture on American rootstock, presenting the opportunity to spread these foreign vines and had given good results in previous years. To dispel the complexities, Dr. Jules Guillaume, the French physician and agronomist, made a declaration revolutionary for the time, proclaiming that the genus of wine was in the great variety, thus belying 2,000 years of agriculture, which saw terroir as the determining factor behind the quality of a wine. The dramatic relationship that was established between European viticulture and American disease on the threshold of the 20th century was the basis of the birth of the so-called modern viticulture. The places of viticulture changed. The specialized vineyards ordered in flourishing rows replaced the wooded fields, where mulberry or maple plants were marred vines alternating with fields cultivated with meadows or cereals, especially the vines. Those varieties that had only the characteristic of producing a lot of grapes and being particularly rustic towards the climate were definitely abandoned. On the threshold of post-phylloxera renewal, however, the problem of the backwardness of winemaking techniques, which were not suitable for enhancing the qualitative characteristics of French vines such as Chardonnay or Merlot, manifested itself in all its gravity. The cultivation of foreign vines in Italy on the threshold of the 20th century remained a sporadic and pioneering phenomenon, carried out by some advanced entrepreneurs in Trentino, Alto Adige, and in Friuli, Venezia Giulia, due to its presence of some research and training centers. The replacement of the old varieties with vines of French and partly German origin, favored by post-phylloxera reconstruction, became a generalized phenomenon that led in the few years to the replacement of dozens of old native vines. Their diffusion was initially highly sporadic due to the low productivity, which lower than that of homegrown vines, and to enhance the quality of these vines through winemaking operations were increasingly modernized. This marked the transition from a production of wine mainly intended for self-consumption to that for the market. The cultivation of French grapes in Italy had as its objective the production of French claret wines, an imitation of the Bordeaux clarets that were so successful in the English market. Very often, however, the vine was used as an improper of local variety lacking color and aroma. Cabernet Sauvignon was the most represented variety. In Piedmont, the Marchese Leopoldo Cese della Rocchetta introduced the vine in the 1860 in his epigraphic collection of Rocchetta Tenaro and wrote verbatim, "It is a vine of ordinary robustness, but vigorous, which loves a more fertile soil than Cabernet Franc and gives a uniform production every year. The grape has distinct but somewhat tart flavor. The vine is to be considered among the most valuable and worthy of being propagated." Between reality and imaginary, the metaphor of wine-growing landscape. The great history of Italian viticulture is ultimately the result of many small stories, yet to be told in an archipelago of communities, residences, cultural islands, and distant villages that were formed by the stratification of experiences and peoples around places of great transit and trade. These populations who have preserved intact the immutable rites of pruning, harvesting, and winemaking, we owe the oldest winemaking traditions in Italy. The wine-growing landscape will increasingly become the essential vector of knowledge of the vineyards and wines of an era, and therefore the most important resource for all enological and cultural strategies. The metaphorical potential that a vineyard possesses is very strong. This transfer of sensations from the concrete landscape to the imaginary is a common procedure operated by the vineyard. The vineyard is first and foremost a metaphor of great balance. for the image that emerges from the man-made nature of a harmony between man and plant, a sort of complicity. But it is also an eloquent metaphor for dynamism. The landscape is a bearer of enthusiasm, but at the same time of rigor and stability that confronts and stimulates the consumer. Beware, however, of the negative implications of poorly respected landscape or a poorly maintained vineyard. They can express an unresolved conflict between modernity and nature, or be bearers of a negative message. However, the natural elements of the landscape acquire meaning only in relation to historical and cultural contexts. So, the landscape is a constructed space where the work of man becomes part of it. The landscape is not just what you see. Territorial phenomena are governed by latent structures that do not appear to the eye and must be investigated with appropriate tools. The landscape must testify to the authenticity of a wine. The word authentic comes from the Greek word authentikos, acting on one's own authority. Autos is oneself, entis is being. Authentic, therefore, means essence, true, and territory, not appearance. Therefore, in relation to wine, authentic means genuine, the expression of a well-defined, defended territory. Abstracting ourselves for a moment from the image of nature and the landscape in its evolution according to Western aesthetic taste, we can identify the vineyard landscape around an inhibited nucleus. From an eminently anthropological point of view, as a utopian garden, a good place, resorting to myth, to found on this the memory and identity of its inhabitants. In the shield that Hephaestus adorns with scenes of country life for Achilles, we find the description of a garden vineyard. Therein, he said also a vineyard heavenly laden with clusters, a vineyard fair and wrought of gold. Black were the grapes, and the vines were set up throughout on silver poles. And around it he gave a trench of cyclas, and about that fence of tin. And one single path led thereinto, whereby the vintagers went and came, whensoever they gathered the vintage. From the Iliad. How can we not see in this Homeric description of the garden of the Greeks all the characteristics of the Italian vineyard garden? Aloe, the field planted with vines; Quipus, the tree-lined and orderly garden; the Horto, the luxuriant vineyard surrounded by a wall or a hedge. All right, now let's walk back through these three chapters in order to connect them to the wine world that we're living in right now. We'll put a little bit of modern twist on this. So for chapter 31, the storytelling of autochthony, why a new narrative is needed. This chapter produces one of the most powerful and overused ideas in wine, autochthony. The word itself carries enormous emotional weight. It suggests roots that have a sense of belonging or a native identity or an authenticity. In the wine world, it has become one of the most seductive ways that we position a grape or a region. But when we look in this chapter, it asks us to slow down and examine what we really mean when we use it. Because autochthony is rarely as simple as wine marketing makes it sound. Grapes move, people move, trade routes move. Heck, agricultural systems evolve. Regions absorb influence, they adapt and borrow, and then they reinvent themselves. So when we tell stories about a grape being purely native, purely original, or we have this thought of it being untouched, we're often telling a cleaner story than what history really allows. And that's exactly why this new narrative is needed. In the modern wine industry, the appeal of autochthonous is obvious. Consumers are looking for something new or something distinctive. You know, we look at Gen Z not drinking what their parents drink, and so oftentimes we see them resorting back to something new and distinct. Today, buyers, they want differentiation. Educators, we want categories that help explain an identity, but I think this overall chapter reminds us that the value of a grape does not disappear if its story is more complicated than we hoped. So, in fact, really the opposite is true. Complexity often makes the story richer. That's something to think about. The lessons for today's wine professionals is clear. I think we should stop treating authenticity as something fragile that can only survive inside these perfect origin myths. Authenticity in wine is not weakened by a more honest story, it's strengthened by one. The call to action from this chapter, I think, is very strong. If you work in wine, be more precise with your language. Be more responsible with the history, and don't lean lazily on a word such as native because it sounds romantic. Instead, help your audience understand how grapes become culturally meaningful over time through adaptation and stewardship. That is far more of a powerful story than a mythology disguised as certainty. When we look at chapter 32, International Grape Varieties and the Story of Modern Viticulture in Italy, I think this chapter really takes us into one of the great tensions of modern Italian wine. This role of so-called international grape varieties in shaping the country's contemporary wine identity. These grapes are often presented as outsiders and almost in opposition to local or traditional varieties. But I think this chapter, Scienza, invites us to think more critically than that. Because modern viticulture in Italy it's not about isolation. It was shaped by this exchange and experimentation and modernization. International varieties did not simply arrive as these intruders. They became part of a broader story about aspiration and market pressures, of course, global prestige, and there's this air of like stylistic evolution. What makes this chapter incredibly relevant today, I think, is that the wine industry still loves this binary thinking. Local versus global, native versus international, traditional versus modern. But I think the real world of wine is much messier. And those of us that work in it, we know it's much messier. And with that mess, it makes it more interesting. Italian wine, I think, like all great cultures, has been shaped not only by preservation, but also by encountering it. I think that matters for the modern wine trade because we're still navigating these exact tensions. What should a region protect? How should it adapt, especially in the wave of climate change? What should it borrow from other areas? And more importantly, what should it resist? I don't think these are abstract questions. They affect planting decisions. They impact sales narratives, marketing, branding, and how the wines are received in the marketplace. I think this chapter should encourage wine professionals to move past defensiveness. The goal is not to erase difference, and it's not to surrender identity. That's certainly not the point. I think the goal is to understand that modern wine regions are often built through dialogue between this local heritage coupled with outside influence. Here, I think if we stop talking about international varieties as though they automatically dilute identity, which I mean, sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. I think what matters in this context, intention and the story being told through them. The smartest wine professionals today are not the ones repeating purity narratives, although sometimes it seems that way. They're the ones who can explain how modern wine culture is shaped through this exchange without losing sight of a place. And that gets us to our final chapter for today's episode, Between Reality and Imaginary, the metaphor of the wine growing landscape. So this chapter is one of the most, I think, beautiful because it asks us to think about landscape, not simply as like this physical environment, but more so as an imaginative one. Where the wine growing landscape is real, of course it's real. We see it, we visit it, of course it is. It's made up of hills and soils and roads and villages, weather, agricultural systems, but it's also imagined, and I think that's the part we forget sometimes. It is framed, narrated, photographed, and definitely emotionally loaded. So in other words, the wine landscape is both geography, but it's also the metaphor. That is important, I think, in today's wine industry because landscape has become one of the most powerful tools in wine storytelling. We sell our wines through images of vineyards, through rolling hills. We think of like old stone buildings, very dramatic slopes, sunlit harvest, everything that you could find in like your perfect postcard. But this chapter reminds us that these images they're not neutral. They're curated stories about what we want the landscape to mean. And in a modern market that we're living in today, this really matters because consumers are not just buying wine from a place, they're buying an imagined relationship with that place. It's a sense of beauty, a sense of heritage, certainly a sense of escape, and this belonging to something authentic and meaningful. The danger, of course, is when the imagery completely overtakes the real. When the landscape becomes this branding without labor, where beauty without history and romance without difficulty, a perfect image with no people in it except the consumer. So this chapter is a major challenge to the world of wine. It asks producers, educators, wine communicators, it asks them to tell the fuller stories about the place. Not less beautiful stories, but maybe more truthful stories. Stories that include not only visual poetry in the vineyard, but the work, the memory, the decisions, and above all, I think the human presence that have made the landscape what it is. So if you're going to use landscape as part of your wine story, do it with depth. Don't just show place. Interpret it. Don't just romanticize the vineyard. Explain what made it and who made it. Because the most compelling wine narratives are not the prettiest ones. They're the ones that help us see and understand more clearly. So taken together, I think these 3 chapters offer a serious challenge to the modern wine industry. It asks us to rethink what autochthony really means and move beyond easy myths of origin. It also asks us to look more honestly at how so-called international grapes help shape modern Italian viticulture. And it also reminds us that wine landscapes are never just seen. They're imagined and narrated, which give them meaning. So what does that demand of us? I guess it demands that we become more careful storytellers. We resist simplistic categories, and we stop confusing romance with truth. It also demands that we recognize how much power there is in words and images when we choose to talk about wine. Because right now, in our modern wine industry that we're living, people who stand out, I don't think will be the ones who tell the most familiar story. They'll be the ones who tell the most thoughtful ones. So whether you're a sommelier, a buyer, a sales rep, a producer, importer, educator, or just a student of wine, anywhere in the wine world, here's the challenge. Question the narrative you have inherited. Ask whether the words you use actually illuminate wine or simply decorate it. Ask whether you are telling a story that flatters the bottle or one that deepens the listener's understanding of it. Because wine deserves more than slogans. It deserves honesty, interpretation, but more so, it deserves storytellers who are brave enough to make complexity compelling. I think that's how we keep wine relevant. We keep it alive, and that's how we make an old story new again. So with that, I want to thank you for joining me for episode 11 of the Art of Wine Storytelling on the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm Ryan Robinson, and it's always a pleasure to walk through these chapters with you to bring their ideas back to the context of today's wine world. Until next time, keep reading, keep tasting, and keep telling stories that give wine its meaning.
You've been listening to The Art of Wine Storytelling by Professor Attilio Scienza, read and commented by Ryan Robinson. The book is available now on our site, Mama Jumbo Shrimp, and Amazon. Follow the Italian Wine Podcast on all the major platforms so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to rate and review us.